All right, let's talk variables and expressions. Now, if this is the first time you're hearing about them or you've already heard of them and just don't quite get them, this is how you want to think about it. Think of numbers, so whole numbers, fractions, decimals, even negative numbers, so integers. Think of those as the letters of the alphabet. And variables and expressions are the words that we can build with those letters, or the sentences that we can create, and then the stories that we can tell that represent problems or situations that we're trying to solve using math. And variables and expressions give us that nice step-by-step, systematic, organized way to solve those problems. So they take your math to the next level after you understand, the basics of numbers and that sort of thing. So let's get some definitions going first. So what is a variable? Well, a variable is a symbol that represents some measurable quantity. So maybe we're trying to measure time, or how much money someone has in a bank account, or how fast a car is going. The most common variable you'll see is x, and maybe you're already aware of that. I don't know why, but it just is. Maybe because it doesn't look like a number, so it's easy to find, it's easy to see in an equation, for example. But we can also use y. Y is a pretty common variable. Z also shows up in higher level math. T, very common because T often represents time. So the letter we choose for our variables is usually the first letter of that word or of that quantity that we're measuring. So maybe if we're talking about price, we might use P, for example. All right, what is an expression? Simply put, an expression is a math sentence. And it uses, or it consists of numbers, variables, and operations. So an example of a math sentence or an expression might be 5 plus 1. So we have numbers and an operation. We could have 10 times 2 minus 4 divided by 3. That's an expression. That's a math sentence. We could even have x plus 1 or t plus 1, right? It doesn't matter what variable we choose. We could have an expression of just variables and operations, no numbers, and maybe it looks like this. Maybe it looks like ax squared plus bx plus c. Now, these don't mean anything right now, but in specific contexts, it might be nice to just look at ax squared plus bx plus c instead of trying to explain it all in sentences in English or whatever language you speak. Because if we write this, a lot of people are going to understand immediately what that is, regardless of which language they speak, because we're speaking the language of math. It's universal. So let's look at an example where variables and expressions might be helpful. Let's say you're planning a trip to Hawaii and you know all in the cost of the trip. So going out to eat at all the restaurants you want to go to, the activities you want to do, the hotel that you're going to stay at. Let's say it costs $4,000. And we're going to introduce a variable called n. N is going to represent the number of people going. And we want to figure out what's it going to cost per person. Well, if n is equal to 1, in other words, one person is going on the trip, the cost per person, what we do is we take the cost of the trip, divide it by 1, because there's only one person going, and we get $4,000 per person. That makes sense. If one person is going, that person is going to pay for everything. What if 2 people go? Again, we would take the cost of the trip and we would cut it in half, or we would divide it by 2, so each person pays a equal and fair amount. And that's going to come out to be $2,000 per person. Well, what if it's 4 people that go? Well, again, we would take the price of the trip, or the cost of the trip, and then divide it by 4, the number of people going, and that's going to come out to be $1,000 per person. So we can sit here and do this a bunch, but I see a pattern. The cost per person, so the cost per person, we can write it as an expression. It's equal to the cost of the trip divided by the number of people. This is an expression. We have numbers, we have an operation as division, and we have a variable. And it tells us the story of this trip, or of this particular aspect of the trip, which is what's the cost per person depending on the number of people going. So one thing that this allows us to do is it gives us a really easy formula, and we can just plug in whatever number of people we want to imagine going on this trip. Maybe it's 10 people, so we would plug in 10 there for n and do 400 divided by 10 and get $400 per person. So not only does it give us a really short formula, but it shows us that as the number of people going increases, the cost per person goes down. So maybe if you want to do this trip, but you don't want to spend $4,000 going by yourself, well, get a group and cut the costs, or split the costs evenly. And you'll probably have more fun doing that anyway. But if you want to go by yourself, just know that you have to save a lot and plan it wisely so you don't end up spending more than you plan to. But here's a good example of a real-world example using expressions. So again, variables and expressions, those are the words and sentences that we create using our alphabet of numbers to tell stories and solve real-world problems.